thanks for coming today. I'm excited to talk about nutrition this evening. So essentially, just to expand on kind of what James had said, what we've planned for today is kind of a review of what we consider to be sort of our sport nutrition basics, or kind of the foundation of what we should know for proper fueling for a high performance sport. As I'm aware, there's a large range of people here, so a range of different age groups for athletes, coaches, maybe parents. So our goal is just to kind of get everybody onto the same page. Like James said, this is the first seminar of potentially more. So this one will just help to bring everybody up to the same page, make sure that we're all kind of aware of these kind of key concepts for sport nutrition. So just to give a outline of what we'll talk about more specifically today, we're going to talk about how to eat for better energy. This is probably one of the most common questions that I get from athletes is, what can I eat to have better energy throughout the day? So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about kind of what to eat to support your training. We'll cover pre-workout nutrition, do a quick kind of overview of post-workout recovery, and also cover some kind of basic hydration concepts throughout as well. So first off, eating for better energy levels. So I'm going to talk about a few different topics here that all kind of fall in the category of supporting your energy levels. First one will be your meal timing. So kind of when you have your meals and snacks throughout the day and how that impacts energy. So this isn't an interactive poll, but just for reflection, if you want to kind of think about your own eating habits, as I find sometimes this can help to, just identify maybe areas of change that might be warranted, but think about how often you have a meal or snack throughout the day, and just kind of have that in your mind as we go through the next couple of slides. So whether it's 1 to 2 hours, 2 to 3, maybe 6+, think about kind of your typical meal routine and where you fit in there. And then we'll cover kind of what's ideal and what's recommended, and you can compare where you're at to that. So first off, here's an example of how what we eat throughout the day and the timing of those meals and snacks can impact our energy levels throughout the day. Excuse me. So this red line here represents how energy levels might fluctuate based on what we're eating and when. So this individual here wakes up in the morning at 7 a.m. We can see that they don't eat anything. Maybe they're not a breakfast person. Maybe they just kind of ran out the door. But for whatever reason, they skip breakfast. And after an overnight fast, so waking up first thing in the morning, they haven't eaten anything for 6 to 8 hours or however long they slept for. So energy levels are already a little bit low. By the time they get to 10 a.m., energy levels have dropped because that fast has just been kind of prolonged. So this person's feeling tired, hungry, maybe a little grumpy, definitely lacking some focus and concentration. So at 10 a.m., they have a granola bar, which can certainly be a healthy enough choice, but there's not really anything there with the granola bar to help to kind of sustain that energy or make it a little bit more substantial. So this leads to a short-term burst in energy and then a crash. And then at noon, this person has a sandwich, so kind of a balanced meal. We can see kind of a more gradual rise and fall in energy levels there. And then for whatever reason, throughout the afternoon, between noon and 7 p.m., we don't have anything to eat. So maybe we're busy, maybe we forget, or whatever happens. But by 7 p.m., energy levels have really dipped. At this point, we're maybe feeling, ravenous, so starving, over hungry, maybe feeling kind of lightheaded, just generally unwell, especially if you're very sensitive to these feelings. And then that causes this person to overcompensate then with kind of a larger portion at dinner. So we see that massive kind of energy increase and decrease. And even though this person's kind of physically full because they just had a large portion of dinner, because they haven't properly fueled all day, they're not quite satisfied. So they're kind of snacky. And in this case, they have some chocolate chip cookies for kind of an evening snack. So here we can see kind of how these energy levels are influenced throughout the day. This person's kind of on a bit of a roller coaster in terms of energy, definitely feeling kind of all the spikes and crashes, and something that we certainly want to avoid with kind of having a more regular and routine meal pattern. So generally speaking, that kind of goal range for meals and snacks, we want to try and aim for a meal or snack every 2 to 4 hours. This, of course, would depend on kind of when your training is, breaks for eating at school or work or wherever you are, but generally kind of keeping that range in mind. If we're eating more routinely, so every 2 to 4 hours, we're constantly getting a source of energy. So we're avoiding kind of our energy levels dipping too low. If we're eating balanced meals and snacks, we're avoiding any kind of big spikes and crashes. We're controlling hunger, so our meal sizes are more appropriate. And we're probably just feeling better and higher energy overall, which is going to support our training wherever that fits in the day. So the biggest things here are being consistent. So if you're somebody who looked at that original question and thought, I have no idea how often I eat throughout the day, that would be the first step, is to kind of get consistent with your meal pattern and however that kind of fits into your typical routine, but generally aiming for something every 2 to 4 hours. And then in terms of how to balance those meals and snacks, we'll talk about that more, but generally we're looking for kind of complex carbohydrate with some protein or healthy fats. Carbohydrates are going to give you an energy source, and then protein paired with that will help to slow digestion and sustain that energy source for longer. So avoiding that kind of spike that we saw with the granola bar example as a snack. So the second part for eating better energy levels is, or second concept is understanding what or where we get energy from in our food. So here we're going to take a quick minute to review macronutrients. Some of you might be very familiar with this, but just need to review it just to make sure, again, everybody's on the same page. So our macronutrients are our carbs, protein, and fat. These are likely things that you've heard of before, but why this is important in sport nutrition is because the way that our body uses these nutrients to kind of fuel our sport and provide us energy is different. So essentially we can think of carbs, protein, and fat as being the building blocks of the food that we eat. So whatever it is that we're eating, whether it's a burger and fries, whether it's a quinoa salad with chicken, that meal is going to be made up of some combination of these 3 macronutrients. And these are the nutrients in our food that give us energy or calories. So they all kind of give us calories in the food that we eat, but we use them differently for training and fueling. So it's important to understand kind of how our body uses each one of these things to understand kind of how to purposefully fuel throughout the day for training and recover as well. So we'll talk about each one. Carbohydrate first. So carbohydrates as sources, we can think of as maybe our typical, carbohydrate food. So things like whole grains, pasta, rice, cereal, potatoes. Some dairy products are sources of carbohydrate as well. So milks has natural lactose milk sugars, so that would contribute, or flavored items like yogurt, chocolate milk would have a higher carbohydrate content. Fruit as well has natural sugars, or things like fruit juice. So whatever it is that we eat that has carbohydrates, these carbohydrates will digest, break down into little sugars, and we store these sugars in our muscle. And that's what kind of fuels any of the activity that we do. So carbs are providing our main source of fuel for any of the training that we're doing, especially our higher intensity training. It also provides fuel for our brain. So if you've ever gone too long without eating and you find that you get a headache or you're kind of just lacking focus, sometimes that's your body's kind of telling you that you're lacking that carbohydrate. So just generally, and we'll talk about this more, we want to try and include a source of carbohydrate at each meal and snack throughout the day, especially during times of heavy training. So when we're in a period of high intensity training, we want to make sure that we're including these carbohydrate sources routinely. So generally with each meal and snack that you have. Protein is next. So protein in terms of sources, we have animal sources and then plant-based or non-animal sources. So meats like chicken, fish, beef are all sources of protein. Some of the alternatives would be things like dairy. So milk, cheese, Greek yogurt especially, or cottage cheese are quite high in protein. Things like eggs, nuts and seeds or nut butters are sources of protein. Beans, lentils, tofu, edamame for those who are maybe vegetarian or include vegetarian protein in their diet. Hemp seeds I have on there too, or just kind of seeds in general. These are all protein sources. Now, one of the big misconceptions I find with sport nutrition is that we don't actually use stored protein as energy to fuel our training. So unlike carbohydrate, which we're storing and we're using that to fuel training, protein is helpful for other reasons, but we're not actually using it as a fuel source ideally. Protein is going to be helpful though for building strength, for recovery. Our muscles are made out of protein, so they're kind of the building blocks of what helps to keep us strong, recovering after workouts. It also helps to support our immune system. So our immune system is made up of little protein, and often if we're kind of not getting enough overall nutrition or protein in our diet, the immune system tends to take the first hit. So that can be important during cold and flu season. And generally, we want to kind of aim to pair carbohydrates with, pair protein with our carbohydrates at each meal and snack. Protein is slower digesting, so it'll help to kind of slow the digestion of those carbohydrates, giving you more sustained energy, like I mentioned before. So kind of our general rule of thumb for snack and meal balance throughout the day, we're thinking having carbs and protein at every meal and snack that we have. And here's some ideas of what that looks like, or examples. So we've got complex carbs there with protein on the left. So whole grain crackers and cheese, fruit with some almonds, Greek yogurt with fruit, or we have some combination items on the right side. So milk smoothie with some either protein powder or Greek yogurt and fruit, trail mix. So some nuts and seeds to give a little bit of protein, and then dried fruit for carbohydrate. These are all just examples. It doesn't have to be complicated, but the main thing is that we want to just have that combination in there to give us those two nutrients that we need throughout the day. And then the third nutrient is fat. So fat as a nutrient, we are not using as a fuel source so much during training, especially kind of higher intensity. We can burn some stored fat in kind of lower intensity activity that we're doing or something that we're very, very accustomed to. But for our kind of high intensity training periods or sessions, so anything that's kind of higher effort, we're going to be using carbohydrate as a fuel source there. So for that reason, we don't tend to focus on fats a whole lot in our kind of initial or early performance nutrition talks. But it is important for a variety of other reasons. So fats are essential for keeping our brain healthy, our eyes healthy. They're important to help absorb vitamins in the foods that we eat. So generally, we want to make sure that we're getting healthy fats throughout the day, even though it won't be kind of a big focus of our conversation probably for the remainder of tonight. And then the piece that does tend to impact performance, or more specifically recovery, is that some fats can have an anti-inflammatory or pro-inflammatory effect. So just to kind of back up, an example of inflammation, for those who maybe aren't familiar, would be if you hit your knee on something, it turns red and maybe it gets swollen. That's your body's inflammatory response to help that knee heal. So anytime that we're training at high intensities, our muscles can get kind of broken down a little bit, little tears can happen. And part of our natural healing process in that recovery period after a workout is that a little bit of inflammation will take place. Completely normal. And again, part of what helps us heal and recover. But there are certain foods, especially fats, that can have a more pro-inflammatory effect and kind of prolong that inflammation and maybe slow down that healing and recovering process, versus other types of fats that have more of an anti-inflammatory impact, which can help to kind of calm inflammation and actually help the body to recover. So generally, we want to aim for more of these anti-inflammatory fats in our routine day-to-day eating. And these are things like salmon, nuts and seeds, avocado, kind of what we think about as those healthy fat sources. And then more of our pro-inflammatory fats on the right side are usually just our more processed foods. So things that are greasy, takeout, pastries, butter. These are just foods that we want to get less of. Again, just to kind of help the body in a recovery process. This is especially important if you're in a state of training where you're kind of training daily, maybe twice a day, just to kind of help to support your body in that recovery process as much as possible. And then the third piece for eating for better energy levels is, okay, how do we kind of balance our meals and what do we put on our plate to give us kind of optimal energy levels for the training that we're doing? So think about this question again. So on a heavy training day, so a day that you're training at higher intensities, which macronutrient or food do you think should take up the most room on an athlete's plate? So carbohydrate, fats, protein, or vegetables. Just think about what you think would be best. And then, of course, we're going to talk about it in the next couple minutes. So we like to use these visuals of an athlete's plate for these types of sessions, because every athlete on this call here today will have slightly different nutrition needs. They're very much, unique to you. So using these plates, though, can help to give us an idea of proportions that you might have, which would be similar for each athlete. For somebody who has kind of a bigger appetite, maybe it's a bigger plate or a smaller plate, but the general proportions will be more or less the same. So this first image here is our optimal meal balance or plate distribution for a heavy training day. Heavy training day would be if you're training for at least 2 hours of high intensity or vigorous activity. So all outs, very minimal breaks. In this scenario, we're filling half of our plate with our carbohydrate sources. So grains and starches, fruit, anything that we had kind of mentioned previously. Half our plate, or 50% volume of what we're eating, is coming from those carbohydrates. A quarter of our plate, or 25% of the volume of food, is coming from a protein source. So any of the meats or alternatives that we talked about before. And then the remaining quarter of the plate is coming from vegetables. So we haven't talked about these guys so much yet, but vegetables are high in fiber. They're good for us. Of course, we all know that. High in antioxidants, so help to kind of help inflammation and are just kind of generally good for us. So we're kind of filling the rest of the plate with those vegetables there. If we compare that to what our plate would look like for a moderate training or a light day or rest day, our moderate training day would be if we're working out or training for, say, 1 to 2 hours of moderate to vigorous activity. So maybe the intensity is reduced or the overall time is reduced. We can see now that our carbohydrate portion has shifted. So we're eating less. Instead of 50%, we've kind of shifted to about a third of the plate-ish. And then the remainder of that space now is filled up with more vegetables to make up for the lack of the reduced carbohydrate. And then if we compare that to our light training day or rest day, we've reduced the carbohydrates a little bit more to just a quarter of the plate. And then vegetables are now taking up the bulk of that half of the plate. So you'll notice here that the portion of protein doesn't change. So another misconception that I find often in sport nutrition is that our protein needs don't change based on our level of activity day to day. So protein needs are determined based on your size, your kind of training goals, your overall kind of training levels. But from a day-to-day perspective, those needs will be more or less the same. So that's not changing here. It's going to always be kind of that quarter of your plate. What is changing though is that as our intensity or duration of our workouts increases, our demand for energy increases. And that energy is coming from carbohydrates, so that portion will increase along with it. So just to give you kind of an idea of how you can adjust or tweak the portions based on the type of training day or where you're at in your season even, to get a more accurate kind of nutrient balance. So just to put, again, all of this into practice, if we look at this kind of typical or example of a breakfast, we've got a bagel with butter and juice, and we can see when we eat this breakfast, what happens to energy levels. So there's not really much here to sustain energy levels. If we think about what's missing, we don't have any protein. We've got some fats there, but we're kind of missing some healthy fats. And the carbohydrate that we're getting is more refined, more processed, lower fiber. So nothing's really there that's going to help to sustain our energy throughout the morning. So we see that in getting more of a spike and a quicker dip or crash in our energy levels. If we compare that to an upgraded breakfast, and maybe swapping out the white bread for whole grain, we're adding in peanut butter instead of butter, whole fruit instead of juice to add some fiber, milk as an alternative liquid because it's got some protein. This has kind of generally higher fiber, healthy fats, better protein, and will lead to a slower digesting breakfast. And so this energy that we're getting from this meal, even if the calories are the exact same or the energy is the exact same, it's going to hold us longer and kind of take us nicely into our training session. Okay, so now to switch gears and talk about pre-workout nutrition. So our goals of pre-workout nutrition is to build our muscle energy stores or our glycogen stores. So ideally, we want to head into our workout with a full tank of energy. And we do that by making sure that we're getting enough carbohydrates specifically, but the right balance of macronutrients all day, and especially during our pre-workout period of time. So we're going to talk about kind of the actual pre-workout period of time, which is the 4 hours before you start training. But keep in mind, if you're in a time where you're in kind of a higher intensity training period, and you're training, once daily, every day, more than once a day, really we can kind of think about most of the things that we're eating as preparing us for training. So it's all kind of pre-workout, but we're going to focus in here now on just that kind of 4 hour period before we actually train. So we're looking to kind of optimize those energy stores. And then we also want to make sure that we're avoiding any digestive distress, any cramping, any nausea, any of those nasty symptoms that can sometimes happen if we eat the wrong types of food or the wrong amounts of certain types of food too close to training. So a lot of this, especially the digestion piece, comes down to how quickly we digest each of these macronutrients. So just generally speaking, carbohydrates, like I've mentioned, are the quickest nutrient to digest. Most carbohydrates, especially if they're eaten on their own, will digest within about 2 hours, some much quicker, just depending on the source. Protein, like I've mentioned, takes a little bit longer to digest. That's closer to the 2 to 5 hour mark. And then fats, out of our 3 nutrients, takes the longest to digest, typically kind of 4 to 9-ish hours, again, depending on kind of the amounts, the source, and kind of packaging that we're consuming them in. But keeping this in mind, we're going to work through some scenarios of what might typically work for pre-workout meals and snacks, depending on how much time you have before you start training. And keep in mind that digestion will be different for everybody. So I'm going to talk kind of average and what works for maybe most. But if you are looking at this and thinking, okay, I need to be a lot more conservative than that because I get cramping or I feel nauseous, that's completely common and normal. So you'll just have to kind of tweak based on what works for you. You might also look at this and think, okay, I can definitely eat more than that or push the boundaries a little bit more without getting any kind of nasty symptoms. And that's totally normal too. So just kind of keep that in mind that this is kind of just a starting point, and then you'd always have to kind of tweak based on what works best for you. So here's our chart for our pre-workout period of time. So again, this is kind of, we're zooming in on the 4 hours before we start training. And we can see kind of, we've got our 3 nutrients. They're all in triangles in our chart. Carbohydrates is the largest piece. And that's because that's what we're focusing on mostly during this pre-workout period of time. Protein is a little bit smaller, and that's just because, like we saw in the last slide, it's a little bit slower digesting. So we just need to kind of be cautious with the amounts, maybe, especially as we get closer to training. And fats, same kind of thing. This represents kind of the smallest proportion of what we're eating in this pre-workout period of time. We can still have some, but we definitely want to be a little bit more cautious of how much, especially as we get closer to training. So this chart that I'm going to show you, I've got some examples here. This is not to say that you should be eating at each of these intervals, but these are just examples of kind of, again, portions and the makeup of the food that you eat and how that should be determined based on how much time you have left before training. So if kind of in general, if you have 3 to 4 hours of time before training to eat a meal, that's usually enough time for most of us to digest what we would consider kind of a full balanced meal. So if you think about our athlete's plates that we talked about previously, a meal like that, I've got some examples here too. So something like oats with nuts and seeds, fruit, we've got some chickpeas there with vegetables, rice, we've got pasta with chicken and vegetables. Whatever your kind of typical balanced meal is for you, generally this is enough time to kind of digest that typical meal. As we get closer to training, so hit the 2-hour mark, so 2 hours before we start training, this is when we need to be generally more cautious about the portion of food that we're getting. So here we're aiming for a smaller meal or more of a snack type of food. So it could be a smaller portion of any of those meals that I mentioned previously, or it could be something like a smoothie. The general kind of rule of thumb is that we're aiming for carbohydrates and then a little bit of protein as well. So a smoothie with fruit, Greek yogurt, or protein powder, some kind of protein source. We've got a yogurt parfait there. So Greek yogurt, say, with some fruit, granola, piece of toast with peanut butter, banana, hemp seeds, just as a few examples, but we're focusing on carbohydrates with some protein. The reason why we still want to get some protein in if we're having a meal or snack at the 2-hour mark is because we still have 2 hours left before we train. And as we saw in that digestion chart, carbohydrates will digest within 2 hours. So if we only have something with carbs here, we might find that we've kind of burned through those carbs really quick and we're hungry again before training or maybe mid-training. So having that protein there helps to just kind of make that carbohydrate snack last a little bit longer or be sustained. And then as we get closer, so say 1 hour or less before starting training, this is when most of us are most prone to digestive upset based on what we eat. So we need to be a little bit more sensitive or cautious. Here, we no longer have enough time to digest protein or fats. So we're focusing on a carb snack and generally something that's easier to digest. So maybe something that's lower fiber. Banana works well for most people. Simple granola bar or some applesauce tends to work well too. So the kind of combination here that works, again, will depend on the person. So the biggest thing looking at this is to kind of plan ahead and try some different combinations out to see what works best for you. Some people might prefer to have kind of a full meal 5 hours ahead and then a snack at that 2-hour mark, and that might take them nicely into kind of feeling good during their training session. Others might prefer to do kind of a 3-hour meal or a 4-hour meal and then a quick kind of carb snack right before, and that works well for them. The biggest thing though is to kind of plan ahead and start putting some of these things into practice. So being a little bit more maybe proactive with how you fuel and when you fuel before training versus just thinking, okay, I'm training in a couple hours. What do I eat? I'm hungry all of a sudden. And then the other thing to keep in mind too, like I said, everybody's digestion will be different. So if you're used to, for example, eating a higher fat diet in general, you might be able to tolerate more fat closer to training than somebody else. If you have a high fiber diet, maybe you're vegetarian, you eat lots of beans and lentils and vegetables, you might find that you can tolerate more complex carbs or fiber kind of closer to training too. So again, use this as kind of your building blocks and then adjust based on what works best for you. And then just to summarize our pre-workout fueling, we like to use something called the 3-2-1 rule. So this is just kind of a summary of what I just talked about. But again, maybe easier to remember. So what we're eating just depends on how much time we have left. So 3 hours before, we're having a meal with carbs, protein, fats. 2 hours before, small meal or snack with just carbs and protein. 1 hour before, carbs only. So that's kind of our general rule of thumb. Again, maybe a little bit easier to remember. Okay, so another question here. We're going to talk a little bit about pre-workout hydration. So think about true or false. By the time you're thirsty, you're already dehydrated. You've probably heard this before. And we'll talk about whether or not that's true. So we have some numbers here, all about hydration. So just first off, being dehydrated, essentially is what happens when we're not consuming enough fluid to meet our just basic hydration needs, or maybe to make up for the amount that we're sweating in training. And this can impact performance, both physically, mentally. So if anybody here before has, experienced what it's like to be dehydrated, you find that you're kind of dizzy, lacking focus, lacking kind of physical strength. So these are all kind of symptoms that can happen when we are dehydrated to an extent that we would actually notice these symptoms. Now, 2% is the first kind of number we have there. That's the level of dehydration which starts to impact performance. So basically this means that you've lost 2% of your body weight in fluid, and maybe that's just kind of all day, just from not drinking enough. Maybe that's from kind of sweating heavily during a training session, but this is the level of dehydration which starts to have an impact on performance. 3% dehydrated, so now we've lost 3% of our body weight in fluid. This is the level of dehydration that causes you to sense thirst. So it is true when they say that by the time you're thirsty, you're already dehydrated. Although for most people, it's not a significant or severe dehydration. So it's not enough that you would ever notice. You're not feeling dizzy, you're not feeling unwell. But from a training perspective, it is dehydrated enough to start to have a negative impact on performance. So we really have to be kind of proactive with our hydration and kind of drinking enough fluid throughout the day. And the impact that dehydration can have on performance is significant. So performance decreases by 10% when you're dehydrated. So that can be very significant. And again, that could be from a physical energy perspective. It could be from kind of a mental focus perspective, but definitely significant. So something that we want to be a little bit more proactive with. And so our goal with pre-workout hydration is we want to show up at our training session hydrated. And really we do that by kind of drinking fluid throughout the day. So when you wake up, all throughout the day, having something with meals can be helpful too. Really always having a water bottle in sight can be the best thing to encourage regular drinking. It is a habit. So if you're kind of not in that habit, it can be hard to build. And so you might need to set kind of little reminders for yourself, whether it be having your bottle with you, just to make sure that you're drinking. But the more you get into that habit, the less kind of mental effort it takes and the more just routine it becomes. And that's really the best thing that you can do to just kind of generally stay hydrated throughout the day. If you start a training session hydrated and you have kind of a sip of water every 15 minutes during your training session, that tends to be enough to then maintain hydration for most people. So really that's kind of our goal, is to start out hydrated. Now, just like nutrition needs, everybody's fluid needs here will be different. Everybody's, different sizes, ages, different sweat rates during training. So it's difficult to get too specific here. But one measure that you can use for your own kind of assessment of your hydration is urine color. So we're aiming for kind of a pale yellow urine color. That is what shows us that we are hydrated. So for example, you might wake up first thing in the morning, you've had, 6, 7, 8 hours of sleep, and you haven't had, assuming you haven't had anything to drink during that time, often your urine color will be more concentrated, darker, but as you kind of drink and hydrate throughout the day, it gets lighter. So that's just kind of one example, but this can be kind of a measure that you can, just be aware of for yourself, just to make sure that you're staying on track and drinking enough fluid throughout the day. Okay, and then we've got our post-workout nutrition here, just to do kind of an overview of our recovery nutrition and some concepts that we want to be aware of. So there are both short-term and long-term benefits to recovering properly after we train. In the short term, it can help with energy levels. So the longer we go after a training session without eating, the more our energy levels will get depleted, the more food it's going to take then to bring them back up to, a level that we want them at. Same thing with hunger levels. The longer we go without eating, the more likely we are to get into that stage of being kind of over hungry or ravenous, and then lead to kind of overeating and that sort of thing that we saw way at the beginning here. Helps to support the immune system just by helping the body to recover properly. And of course, supports muscle health. So our muscles are made out of protein. During workouts, we get little tears and damage that occurs to our muscles. So having proper nutrition, especially protein, in that recovery phase will help to kind of build your muscle, build your strength, and help to just support your overall muscle health. In the long term, those who recover properly with nutrition after training tend to be at less risk of injury. It can also help you to adapt to higher training loads. So just by kind of recovering properly after your training sessions can help you to be able to kind of build on and take on more training and help your body to kind of adapt to those different training loads as well. So just generally, what are we looking for? So we use the 3 R's as kind of a easy to remember rule for eating after training. So first, we want to refuel. So during our training session, we've burned carbohydrates. So we want to make sure that we're adding in or replacing those glycogen stores with new carbohydrate. So we definitely want to make sure that carbs are part of this meal or snack. We want to rebuild or repair our muscles with protein, like I mentioned before. So we want to make sure that protein's there too. And then we want to rehydrate with fluid. So basically replacing any of the sweat that we lost during our training session. And generally, we want to try and do this within an hour after training. That tends to be when the muscles are most able to kind of efficiently recover and restore. So we're aiming for this kind of meal or snack within an hour of our training session. This doesn't necessarily have to be an additional meal and snack to your regular routine. If you're eating every 2 to 4 hours, this could just be, your dinner or the next meal or snack that might be in your rotation. But the most important thing is we want to make sure that those carb and protein is there, and then fluid as well. And then in terms of fluid, like I mentioned, we want to try and replace what we've lost in sweat. And again, everybody's fluid needs are different. Everybody's sweat rates are different here. But we can do this by kind of measuring our weight. So if you take your weight before and after you train, you can see how much sweat or fluid you've lost during the training session, and then use that to figure out how much water you need to drink to build or replace that lost fluid. So our example here is we have an athlete who is 120 pounds, trains, weighs after in at 118. So we've lost 2 pounds of fluids there, which means that this individual would have to drink 2 500 ml water bottles to replace that fluid. So general rule of thumb, 1 pound of fluid lost is a 500 ml water bottle, just to kind of make it easier to remember. The actual amount would be different kind of depending on the person, but this tends to be sort of a minimum that most people would need. So it's a good kind of rule of thumb to follow. But if you're curious about how much you're losing, this could be kind of a good way to accurately know and then know how to replace. And then lastly, we've just got some portable meal and snack ideas. I find that sometimes it's kind of the practical stuff that we can struggle with in terms of just how to put this into practice and have some grab and go items. So turkey or chicken wrap, having some leftover protein from dinner always makes for kind of an easier lunch the next day. So that could be something that you pack with you. Smoothies, I mentioned a couple times, can be a good kind of balanced option. Overnight oats can be a great breakfast or snack or lunch. If you haven't heard of them before, it's basically you can kind of mix your oats with milk. Sometimes there's protein powder, sometimes there's yogurt, sometimes nuts and seeds or peanut butter, fruit. You kind of mix everything into a jar cold, let them sit in the fridge. And overnight or over at least 4 hours, the oats will soak in the liquid from the milk or whatever liquid you've used. And then they're ready to eat kind of after that sitting period. So you don't actually have to cook them or heat them up. They're just kind of a good option. So some people like to do that for like a meal prep breakfast in the morning. And again, something that's grab and go, you can eat cold or you can warm it up if you want. Yogurt parfait, bean salad. Sometimes kind of like a snack box type of lunch or snack can work well. So if you think about kind of having a couple protein sources, some carbs, veggies. So we've got the example there of hard-boiled eggs, cheese, crackers, vegetables. Little cans of tuna can be a good kind of convenient option too, with crackers or pretzels, fruit, pita and hummus. Trail mix we talked about, hard-boiled eggs, again with granola bar, nut butter on bread, protein pancakes. So there's lots of recipes online, but you can make pancakes with, sometimes it's Greek yogurt, sometimes protein powder, depending on the recipe, but you can freeze these and then bring them with you and have them as like a recovery or a pre-workout or just a snack throughout the day. Or Greek yogurt, again, and granola bar. Greek yogurt and cottage cheese are really high protein sources, so those can be kind of good options as well. All right, so just top takeaways, and then we've got some time for questions. We want to try and eat every 2 to 4 hours throughout the day, and then always pairing protein and carbohydrates every time you're eating. Pre-workout, we use the 3-2-1 rule, so kind of use that to figure out what your optimal kind of pre-workout eating routine is. And then recovering after training, we use the 3 R's, so getting in our refueling with carbohydrate, repair with protein, rehydrate with liquid or fluid. Okay, so we've got some time for questions. Let me just, I'll remove my shared screen just so I can see a little bit better, pull up our chat. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. I think Melissa, do you have a hand up?
Yeah, actually it's Francis. Sorry, I'm using my wife's account. Okay. Francis Aim from Thunder Bay. Thanks for the excellent talk, Brittany. I'm wondering if you didn't really talk much about fiber, and I'm wondering, fiber is, very important for cardiovascular health, and maybe, I don't know if you could expand on that for athletic performance, if there's any need for it, or what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. So yeah, you're right. Not something that I focused on a ton. So fiber generally is good for kind of long-term health, so heart health, digestion. So definitely something that everybody needs in their diet, regardless of being an athlete or not. The kind of pro, and can also be a con sometimes with fiber, is that just like protein and fats, it's slower to digest. So when we have higher fiber foods, generally throughout the day, it's a good thing because it keeps us full longer, slows digestion, slows the release of that carbohydrate energy, keeps us more satisfied. The only kind of time when for athletes that we might want to watch the fiber content is as we get closer to training. We don't necessarily always want something that's going to be slower digesting, especially if we're kind of an hour out and a need to kind of grab a quick snack. So generally, for athletes, yes, very important. And from your day-to-day fueling perspective, trying to get good fiber sources in. So complex carbs, whole grains, whole fruits, vegetables, these are all going to be excellent fiber sources that kind of contribute to your total intake. Just maybe be cautious around immediately before training, because sometimes they can increase kind of cramping and that sort of thing during training. But again, it depends on how much you typically eat. Some people are more sensitive than others, but definitely important to include.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Does anyone have any other questions? Feel free to just, again, unmute or raise a hand, or if you feel more comfortable, just drop it in the chat. Both myself and Brittany can see.
Hello, hi Brittany and James. It's Tim from Vancouver calling. My question is about coffee. Like, I heard if you check out the liquids that are coming out your body after you drink any liquids, and if it's a clear color, you are hydrated. But I know I drink 6 to 8 cups of coffee and tea every day, and any liquid that comes out of my body is clear colored. So would that mean I'm hydrated and from the coffee, and what's the deal with coffee?
Yeah, so good question. So coffee is kind of one of those gray areas in terms of hydration. So any fluid, including what's in your coffee, what's in your tea, counts toward your total fluid intake. But the teas and coffee that have caffeine will have a diuretic effect. So usually for the next 2 hours after you drink coffee, you'll find that you're going to the bathroom more often, which can have kind of a slight dehydration effect. So I would say, ideally from a caffeine amount, we don't want to be getting most of our fluid from coffee, just because that would add up to probably lots of caffeine in the day. But it does count towards your total fluid intake. So if you're kind of trying to get, 2 or 3 liters of fluid in a day, and you've got, 1 or 2 coffees, then that definitely counts towards the total fluid intake. If your urine is light in color, then you probably are decently hydrated just from the total fluid that you're getting from the coffee and tea throughout the day. But I would say ideally most of our liquid is coming from kind of water.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Fred Rockall from Aurelio. Brittany, do you have a menu?
A menu, like a meal plan kind of thing?
Yes.
We don't necessarily have meal plans, like general ones, just because, again, everybody's needs would be different. Like if you're working with a dietitian individually, he or she would kind of assess what you need and then could put together something more specific. We've got recipes and that sort of thing, but we don't have kind of one standard athlete menu or meal plan.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yep.
I've heard some folks say that you can sort of fine tune your digestion if you just sort of stick to the same foods by, just eating like the same stuff over and over again. You kind train your body to digest that better? Is there any evidence to that?
So I would say, for somebody maybe who struggles with digestive concerns, sometimes that can be a strategy to, your body likes what's familiar. So if you're finding that you're getting cramps and struggling with digestion, sometimes having a period of time where you're eating more routine foods can help. That being said, I don't think there would be kind of a good long-term benefit, because if you're, just from a digestive perspective alone, if you're eating the same foods day to day and then you have something else, I would say, anything else might be a bit of a shock to your system. And then from a nutrient perspective, we want to get kind of a variety as much as possible. So I would say kind of the biggest things for digestion in terms of routine would be kind of having regular meal times can help. So kind of having some consistency in when you eat, and then, generally what you eat. So you're having kind of protein, complex carbs, vegetables, kind of that similar balance. But then kind of mixing up the individual foods just to, again, get different nutrients, get different types of fiber, pre and probiotics. There's a lot of benefits to kind of having a variety of foods in a diet. So I would say that would be best, just as kind of a long-term way of eating.
Brittany, we have a couple of questions in the chat as well, one from Jonathan and one from Dave.
Yeah, so recommendation for energy drinks and electrolyte drinks during competition. So energy drinks I don't recommend. They're not very well regulated. And so, from a caffeine perspective, it can be difficult to know or be sure of how much you're actually consuming. There is a label in some cases, or you can kind of find it online, but again, they're not well regulated. So there's always a bit of a question mark there. And then electrolyte drinks can be beneficial. So if you're somebody who is a high salt sweater or just a heavy sweater, and you're doing multiple kind of things throughout the day where you're sweating, electrolyte drinks can definitely be kind of a tool to just help optimize your hydration in that scenario. Generally, anything that's kind of under 90 minutes. So if you're just like doing a single workout in a day, they're not necessary. We can get the electrolytes and carbs that we need from food, but in a competition type of setting, it could be a tool that you might want to kind of add in. Like I said, especially if you're a heavy sweater, it could be kind of a good tool. And if you're somebody maybe who is nervous and might not be eating enough carbohydrate, getting an electrolyte drink with some sugars in there too can help from an energy perspective too. So not always necessary, but it definitely could be a tool to use for sure. And then if high coffee intake includes doubles, then we also get cream, fat, and sugar, spiking blood sugars, and potentially replacing eating better calorie sources, correct? Yeah, for sure. So if you're getting doubles throughout the day, lots of sugar, cream, which wouldn't be kind of an ideal source of fat. The sugars alone would spike blood sugars, and then there's nothing there to kind of help to sustain it. So you'd probably get those spikes and crashes. And if you're kind of fueling yourself with those coffees all day and not eating, then you're definitely displacing better kind of balanced nutrients from the diet for sure.
Do we have any other questions, guys? I have a question. Is there any literature or any research done on the crossover between feeding off the digestive system through the stomach and feeding off the reserve within the body?
Like to fuel activity?
Not so much the fuel activity, but all our dietary information that I've heard over, not just you, but over the years, is indicates that it goes in your mouth and it becomes power or source of energy within the body. So it's a intake thing, but when the body starts to feed on itself, is there anything that you know, you can't stop the match midstream because you've dehydrated, so it starts to feed on itself. So is there any literature or any information on that at that level?
So I think what you're referring to is kind of like protein stores, like muscle stores and that sort of thing. Like, at what point do we start to break down those types of things?
Yes.
So typically, if we've got kind of our glycogen stores full, that's going to be the first choice of energy for any high intensity activity. So anything that we have like quick bursts, all outs, and that's because the energy demands are so high. Once those are depleted, which will depend on kind of how well fueled the athlete is, and then just, you know, everybody's a little bit different in how efficiently they kind of burn those carbohydrates. Then we start to go into our stored energy sources. So assuming there's not really much in the way of carbohydrate left because glycogen stores are burned up, the next most efficient fuel source is protein, which would be in our muscle stores. So, you know, for kind of an activity that would be short in time, so say under 90 minutes, typically if we're properly fueled, can, you know, fuel with our glycogen stores. After 90 minutes, we might need to start replacing our energy. So for something that's kind of quicker than 90 minutes, if we're fueled properly, we shouldn't have to kind of break down those muscle stores. So maybe in a competition state, it wouldn't be as big of a concern, but from kind of a long-term training state, that's where those kind of glycogen stores will come into play, because if they're not available, we do risk that we're breaking down muscle tissue at that point. Fat stores will be used for very low intensity activity. So if it's something that the athlete's very well trained with, something that, you know, doesn't have the heart rate up, is kind of what they perceive to be as low intensity, then we could maybe burn fat stores instead. But in a competition state where you're having kind of higher bursts of energy, fat stores will not be efficient enough or broken down quick enough to support that energy. So it'll be kind of muscle at that point.
Brittany, excuse me, Brittany, do we need supplements? You know, protein powders and vitamins that come in pill form, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so it's like, again, it kind of depends on the person. So protein first. I would say, generally speaking, most athletes, most people get enough protein in their diet. That's usually not where we're lacking. So most, you know, can kind of eat regular meals and snacks, get enough protein that they need throughout the day. That being said, if somebody has low appetite, if somebody is looking to build muscle and has higher protein needs and just kind of is struggling to get enough in, then protein powders can then be a tool to help that person meet their needs. But they're not, you know, better than a whole food source of protein, kind of nutritionally. They're just more convenient, and then they're kind of condensed. So if you're struggling to kind of meet your needs, they can be an option, or recovery, if you're kind of out, they can be kind of convenient. And then as far as other nutrients go, it just depends really on the person and their kind of overall diet. If I had to kind of pick a couple that most people would benefit from, I would say vitamin D is one of them, unless you're spending lots of time in the sun. It's really tough to get enough vitamin D from food. So that's one that most kind of Canadians are in need of. Omega-3, if you're not somebody who eats fish, can be, again, helpful just to meet your needs. And then whether or not a multivitamin is necessary, depends on the overall diet. Some people like to take it just as kind of reassurance if they find that, their eating isn't so consistent. But whether it's necessary or not is still kind of up in the air. That's kind of a population level answer.
Brittany, we've got one more question in the chat from Dave regarding keto diet.
Yeah, so any comments on ketone diet? I always understood ketosis was an unhealthy state. Yeah, so for the keto diet, this is a huge topic. I'll try and give a very concise answer. Essentially what it is a very high fat diet. So say 75% fat, about 5% carbohydrate, and then the rest coming from protein. I don't recommend it for athletes. Again, going back to the whole kind of glycogen store and fat burning and muscle burning, it's, if the athlete is in a high intensity training period, you just risk losing too much muscle during training sessions because you don't have that carbohydrate on board. In kind of general population, it can be effective from a weight loss perspective in the short term for some, because it's more kind of satisfying eating larger amounts of fat than kind of an overall calorie restriction. But in the long term, there's a lot of, up in the air of what does it do to health? What does it do to kind of our cholesterol, heart health, metabolism, just from potential kind of muscle loss because protein intake is so low. So generally not something I recommend. And it's kind of like an almost pseudo starvation kind of thing, just with the ketosis, just because generally your body is kind of shifting from eating or burning carbohydrates to ketones. So you're kind of in that pseudo starvation mode, which again, not ideal for athletes for sure. Yeah, long-term, there's a lot unknown. So not something that I would typically kind of recommend in general, but definitely not for our athletes.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I think we're kind of pushing our time limit here, guys. Really appreciate everyone giving up the time and participating in the webinar. Really like to thank Brittany for giving us her time and delivering this presentation. Before everyone logs off, Sport Director Stephen Sheffield is going to make a short announcement about other upcoming webinars and our calendar of events. Thank you, Brittany.
Great. Thanks so much for tuning in.
Thank you.
And thanks for having me.
Thanks, Brittany. That was great.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so just to let everybody know, hopefully my internet's working. We have 3 Chat with Champions coming up in the next month. Starting on April 17th, we're going to have a virtual chat with Jessica Klimkate. We have a sportcaster host of Michelle Grace. That's April 17th at 11:30 a.m. The following week, April 24th, Shadi El Nahas is going to be doing the chat again at 11:30. Both of them are Grand Slam champions. And on May 15th, Keegan Young, former cadet world medalist and youth Olympic medalist, is going to be doing it at 11:30 on May 15th. Also, starting April 14th, we have virtual girls only fitness training for Judo. It's going to be hosted by Carlene Young, who was our World Masters champion. She's going to be hosting. It's going to be on Wednesdays for 6 weeks from 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. And it's for girls only. And also after, or I'm not sure exactly the times yet, James is going to be setting up other experts from CSIO to put on, experts in various fields to put on more of these webinars like we had today. So the fitness training is for, I'm guessing maybe U12 and up for girls. So girls and women. And so we're trying to, if you want to look at the Judo Ontario calendar, we'll have the events in the Judo Ontario calendar with registration links, and you guys can go on there and check for updates. And if you have any questions, please email Judo Ontario, info@judoontario.ca, and we'll get back to you with the answers as best we can.